Hi, I'm Marcia Lehman, and I'm a Knox County Master Gardener. And today we're doing a part 3B in the 5 Ps of growing vegetables in containers. And the reason it's 3B is because 3A dealt with all the cool season crops like lettuce and carrots and beets. It was way too early to talk about the summer veggies, but we're almost there. So 3B is about planting some of those, what we call summer vegetables or warm season vegetables, those that don't like the cold. And in fact, warning number 1, don't be tempted by the really warm days that we have. What you should be watching at this point are what are the nighttime temperatures. If there's a forecast of any chance of frost, you do not want your summer vegetables outside because a frost will kill them. If it's a light frost, it will at least stunt them and they may look poor and they may sit there for a while. If it's a hard frost, it will in fact kill them. So at this point in the second half of April, our average last frost date in Knoxville, roughly, is April 15th. But the average last frost means there's a 50-50 chance. So it's why I haven't made this video earlier, but it's why we suggest that you really wait until the end of April. So a 50-50 chance of frost on April 15th. A week later, around the 22nd, 23rd, there's only about a 30% chance, and by the end of the month, we're down to 10% or less. But I would also ask you to remember that just last year, 2020, we had a frost on May 8th. That's uncommon, but it can happen. So in general, for the summer veggies, if you're growing in containers, because you don't want to have to move all these big containers indoors, you probably want to wait until May 1st. And if you want to be absolutely certain, many people wait until Mother's Day. So with that, let's start with some of our summer veggies. Now, when we did the cool season veggies, I had a 3-gallon container that we planted some beets and carrots and lettuce in, and I have now harvested the radishes and the lettuce. But now, here I have a 7-gallon container. And if you recall back in part 1, which is pick a pot, we said that for most of the summer veggies, you need a bigger pot, a minimum of a 5-gallon container. And the easiest 5-gallon container to get is a 5-gallon bucket. I happen to have a 7-gallon nursery pot, and I like that better than the 5-gallon bucket for a couple of reasons. One, the 5-gallon bucket is taller, but skinnier. What I like about the 7-gallon is that you can see that this is 12 inches high, so I've got enough root depth for even my tomatoes and peppers and eggplant. More importantly, I've got 14 inches in diameter, which will come in handy for some of the other things that we might be direct seeding into this container. So I like the 7-gallon container for that reason. There is another reason I like the 7-gallon container. Again, if you go back to when we talked about picking a pot, there are just a little over 7 gallons in a 1 cubic foot. So if you can find a 1 cubic foot of potting mix or garden soil or container soil, that will take care of 1 7-gallon pot. So it's you don't have to do any of the arithmetic, just go buy a 1 cubic foot bag of your favorite potting mix and you are good to go with a 7-gallon container. So now the question is, what do I want to show you first? I'm assuming that most of you are going to go buy transplants. And so you'll go into a nursery or a garden center and you may find a 4-pack. But I don't know that you want 4 of any particular type of tomato. So you may actually be buying a single plant. And my challenge is I don't use those type of plastic pots. So I have borrowed some plants from some other folks. And here I have a tomatilla, which is a relative of the tomato. So it will serve as my surrogate tomato today. But if you buy it in a plastic container, please resist the temptation to grab it by the stem and pull it out. The risk is you may pinch the stem a bit too hard, and then that restricts the flow of nutrients and water through the plant and it will die. So whether you have a single one in a small pot or a 4-inch pot, which is the more common size, put your fingers around the stem, don't pinch it, turn it upside down, tap the bottom or the sides if you need, slide the plastic off, and here you go. So that's the way you want to remove. Now if you had a 4-pack, you now have 4 of these little things hanging around, so you can take them, and if they've got a nice root structure, they'll hold together, set them down, then take one of them and let the other 3 sit there until you're ready for them. Now, both tomatoes and tomatillos, if you look at the stem, they have all these itty-bitty little tiny hairs. That allows us to plant these a little more deeply, because when those little hairs make contact with the moist soil, they will become roots. And the more roots your plant has, the more nutrients it can take up, the more water it can take up. So we tend to plant these relatively deeply. And how deep is that? Well, if you look at this plant, this is a good example. These first 2 leaves right here are actually the cotyledons. They were part of the seed coat. I would plant it that deeply. I would use these as my depth marker. So I'm going to put almost as much of this stem as the root ball here into the soil. When I'm done, then I will pinch off these cotyledons because they're going to be right at the soil level. So I'll take my trowel and I'm going to dig a nice deep hole here, and I'm going to set that down in, pile it up, mound it up around my cotyledons. My mix is already a little moist, and then I'm going to come back and pinch those off. Now, I'm not ready to set this container outside, plus I need to use it to demonstrate some other things. So I'm actually going to gently dig this back up, which I can do because it has a fairly good root ball on it. And I'm going to stick it back in its container, and it is still in the process of being hardened off. Let me segue to that. What does harden off mean? Well, if you look at this rack over here, these are all the tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, tomatillas, and a variety of other things. There's a couple sweet potatoes up there that I have started indoors. And so when the outdoor temperature gets above 60, I will just roll this whole rack out into the driveway, starting with an hour one day, 2 hours the next day, 3 hours a day after that. And they have yet to spend an overnight outdoors. But before they go into my garden, they will spend a night outdoors. So they are getting accustomed to sunlight, which is so much brighter than even the good grow lights that I have indoors. So hardening off is really important, because otherwise you'll start to notice some of the leaves look like they got scorched, and in fact a plant that has not been adequately hardened off will get sunburn. It doesn't kill the plant, but it kind of stresses it, and it may slow down in its growth. So that's a tomatilla, and those are about the size of most of my tomatoes, and I used this because these were in little pots. Just as a little segue, when I say I don't use those, I use a tool called a soil blocker, which I press into seed starting mix, and I end up with 4 cubes that are 2 inches by 2 inches, and then I drop my seed in there and start my seeds. So that's really what I've got going here. These are 2, I think I can pull these out. These are 2 peppers of a particular variety that have the flavor of a habanero but not the heat. So you see I have no pot, and I will pull those apart when I'm ready to plant them. If you use peat pots, this is a little pepper plant I got from another master gardener. If you use peat pots, first of all, we don't You can plant peppers a little deep, but nowhere near as deeply as we did the tomatoes or the tomatillas. But if you use peat pots and you want to plant the whole pot, make sure it's good and moist when it goes in the ground, because if it's dry, it's really hard and the roots won't come through. But the other thing to do, your peat pot is probably not full, so when you're ready to plant it, pull the part away that is above the ground. Because if any of this is sticking up out of your container mix, it acts like a wick and will pull moisture out of your container, which will then proceed to dry out the plant. So pull that away down to the soil level, and then you can plant it maybe 1/4 to 1/2 inch deeper than it was in that pot. So that kind of takes care of the things that you're likely to go buy at a garden center as a seedling and transplant into your container. Now, a lot of people like to go buy cucumbers. I would say don't do that. You'll spend $3 or $4 for a single cucumber plant, and you will be tempted to buy the biggest one or the one that already has a blossom on it. Please don't do that. If it already has a blossom on it, it's probably too old and it will go through a significant shock when you transplant it into the container. So for the price of what you're paying for that 1 4-inch pot of a squash or a cucumber, you can buy a packet of seeds, and then you would sow, 3 or 4 seeds in the middle of your container. And if your container's already outdoors, I would suggest you take a soda bottle, cut the bottom off, remove the lid, set it over the top of where you planted those 3 or 4 seeds, and this does a couple things. It helps to hold a little bit of moisture. It reminds you of exactly where you put the seeds, and it keeps the birds from digging around in there and eating your seeds. The other thing is that most cucumbers and squash seeds take 4 to 7 days to germinate. And so within 7 to 10 days after that, you're going to have a plant that is as big as that one you were going to buy at the nursery or the big box store. So please resist that temptation and just buy a packet of seeds and start your own cucumbers or squash from seed. Similarly, people will buy bean plants, and again, for the same price, you can get a packet of beans, and they can be bush beans or pole beans. If they're pole beans, you wouldn't use as many, but if they're bush beans, in this container, remember, this is 14 inches wide, I can easily put, at 4 inches apart, I can easily put 9 bean seeds in here and have 9 bush beans. I'm not sure I would put 9 pole beans in there, but if you're growing pole beans, you could easily do 2. And then things like the cucumbers and the pole beans and the tomatoes and the tomatillas need some type of vertical support as they grow. So I would encourage you to get those supports in place as soon as you set that container outside in its final spot. The plant may still be really small, but it's not going to stay small very long. So get whatever support you're going to use for that plant in place as soon as you set the container outdoors. So again, if I'm sowing seeds for cukes or squash or beans, the packet is going to tell me how deeply to plant it, and in most cases, it's somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 inch. Then you need to keep it moist. Now, if your container is indoors, say in your garage, that's a little easier. That's where you can do the same thing we did with the spring things and put a piece of paper towel on top, and you water the paper towel to keep the surface moist. Because again, with seeds, they're down 1/2 inch, and when they start to sprout, the root will go down 1 inch before it comes up at all. So as long as you keep the top couple of inches moist, you're good to go. And we showed you how to do that with a water bottle in the earlier episode. I haven't brought it out for this one. For things like the transplant, where we were putting it in twice as deep, now you are really wanting to keep the soil in the entire container moist. So you'll be using a lot more water when you water for your tomatoes, your peppers, your eggplant, than you will for the things you're starting from seed, until those seeds germinate and the plants start to grow. So by the time you've got about a foot of growth on a cucumber or the like, the roots are going to be down about this far, and then it's the same game. You want to keep the entire container moist. So this is really it for the summer vegetables. You're going to need a bigger pot, just because the summer veggies tend to be bigger plants. In the case of bush beans, you can put more in, but this is really an optimal size container for a tomato that you're going to want to trellis, whether that's a cherry tomato. The tomato fruits may be small, but that plant will get tall, will need vertical support. The tomatillas do the same thing. Peppers are one place where a tomato cage would actually work well as a support and would probably fit inside the container. But for most of the tomatoes, your support's going to have to be outside of the container. So let me just come back and say, I know we've had some really lovely days. It's been nice weather to work outside in shorts and t-shirt, but pay attention to the weather forecast, focusing on, is there any chance of frost in the forecast, and what are the nighttime temps? So we may not have a frost, but tomatoes will tolerate a little bit more cold than peppers, but it's only a few degrees, so play it safe and don't set those containers out if there's a forecast of nighttime temps at 55 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. Again, at 55 it won't kill the plant, but it will not like being cold for 6 or 8 hours overnight, and then it will say, well, I'm just going to sit here and wait. And it may take it a week or two to fully recover. And so the difference is, if you set them out a bit too early and they get cold overnight, versus somebody else who waited a week or two until the nighttime temps were well above 55, your plants are going to look roughly the same, even though you had a 2-week head start, but they got cold overnight. I really can't drive home that point too hard, because it is a very, very common mistake. The second mistake is to go to the nursery or the garden center and buy a large plant. No, buy a small plant. Buy a small plant that has a nice, healthy looking stem. These may look tall, but this stem is nice and thick. It's the diameter of a number 2 pencil. It is not spindly, and those can obviously be planted more deeply. So resist the temptation to buy the bigger plant, which obviously is going to cost you more money. So buy healthy looking plants. They're a nice shade of green, they've got a nice thick stem, there's no discoloration on them. That's your guide to buying a plant. And in fact, you can, in the nursery, very carefully, now that you know how to do this, pull it off and look at the roots. This specimen is in great shape. It's not root bound at all, but if you see the roots going around and around, you should resist buying that, or know that when you get it home, you're going to have to do some surgery and loosen up those roots. Otherwise, they will just continue to go round and round. This is why I like the 7-gallon container better than a 5-gallon bucket for things like our summer vegetables. I hope you learned something today. Good luck in growing your summer vegetables in containers. Thank you for joining us.